We have three distinguished panelists in this session, Dr. Greg Mill, Dr. Masuma Hasan, and Dr. Farooq A. Khan. May I request Dr. Farooq to kindly come to the stage? Okay. The session chair is Dr. Rukhsana A. Siddiqui. Let me introduce her to you. Professor Rukhsana Siddiqui teaches as visiting faculty after retiring from Quaid-i-Azam University, Islamabad, where she was a tenured professor for 30 years. She has taught at several prestigious universities worldwide, such as Bilkent University, Ankara University, University of the Witwatersrand, Johannesburg, and the University of Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. Dr. Rukhsana is a prolific writer. She is author of 3 books on sub-Saharan African political economy and has authored dozens of research papers. Over to you, Dr. Rukhsana.
Thank you very much. All right. Good evening. I would like to introduce Mr. Richard Morrow, who is our first speaker. Unfortunately, Dr. Greg Mills, who was supposed to attend this conference, had a family bereavement. And instead, Mr. Richard Morrow, shall we be giving a presentation on? Yes, it's going to be online. Mr. Richard Morrow is an analyst at Brenthurst Foundation in Johannesburg, South Africa. He focuses on public sector reforms and policy strategies. He has advised 2 presidential advisory teams and worked across 10 African countries and devised investment strategies for them. He read international relations at Durham University.
So firstly, let me extend my thanks to the Pakistan Institute for International Affairs and, of course, Dr. Hassan for extending an invitation to participate. As you did rightfully mention at the start, this was meant to be a presentation delivered by myself and Dr. Greg Mills, who's the director of the Brenthurst Foundation, but unfortunately, due to a family bereavement, he's not able to attend. So I will try and do my best from my side as a co-author, as a co-author of the paper, to share my insights and thoughts. So as part of the session 3, Continuing Colonization, Dr. Mills and myself co-authored a paper which we've titled, I think quite aptly, the Malign Nexus, Undermining African Security and Sovereignty. And really the thrust of our paper, if I could summarize it quite simply, is that 70 years after the Bandung conference and the declaration, is that what we see unfolding in Africa today is not only a form of neocolonialism, which has been discussed in great detail over the years in academic literature, but what we argue to be a more malign form of this neocolonialism. Malign meaning that it is far more damaging to African societies, economies, and indeed the people of Africa. So there's really 3 main parts to the paper which we authored. And in essence, sorry, I trust you can still hear and see me on your side.
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. No, just on my side, it's the screen's gone dead. So essentially, there's 3 main aspects to the paper which we authored, and what we're looking at, if I could just maybe go through them very briefly before going into them in more detail, is firstly Africa's liberation movement. So post-Bandung, 1955 to about 1975, we saw a liberation wave sweep across Africa. And while that gave rise to many independent and sovereign countries, what it also did was introduce a new African elite to the political arena and gave rise to what many of us know today as the phenomenon of neocolonialism. And the second main theme really is the crux of our paper and our main thesis, which is the evolution of this malign neo-colonialism taking shape in Africa. And here, principally, we talk about two case studies in the Central African Republic and Sudan, where we outline a number of stakeholders, both African but also foreign, who are perpetuating this malign neo-colonialism, whereby they are pursuing their own strategic and economic interests at the expense of these two particular African case studies. And then the third and final theme really is the recession, if you could call it that, of the liberal international order, and how this recession is essentially serving as a catalyst for malign neo-colonialism to perpetuate through Africa, given that the checks and balances which would otherwise deter such malign forces are increasingly eroding, thus giving rise to these foreign and African actors to actually pursue their exploitative interests at the expense of Africa. So those are the three main themes of our research paper. I'm more than happy to go into the specifics, starting off obviously with Bandung, 1955. I imagine over the course of today's proceedings, many other speakers have touched on the event and the declaration, indeed the spirit of Bandung and what came as a result of it. So I won't spend too much time delving into that, as again, many of you would have heard much of it. But what I will highlight from an African perspective is that obviously the key takeaway from the conference and indeed the declaration was an emphasis on human rights, sovereignty, and support for multilateralism. The nascent United Nations and its charter, which had emerged shortly after the Second World War. And shortly after Bandung, 1955 onwards, what we saw take place in Africa was a wave of independence sweeping across the continent, starting with the Gold Coast, what is today Ghana, and moving all the way, in many ways, from west to east, as well as south, across the continent. And one particular individual, President Nkrumah from Ghana, gave rise or posited the idea of neo-colonialism, specifically in the context of Africa, arguing that while many African countries had gained the trappings of sovereignty, some of them adopted a new name, they had their own governments, which were represented by an African electorate. In many ways, the erstwhile colonial powers still had a dominant presence and influence over the proceedings within these African countries, particularly as it relates to their economies. And so while you see this wave of independence spread across Africa, the argument that we make is that it did not necessarily give rise to a pan-African movement of egalitarianism or indeed economic emancipation. In many ways, one elite, the colonial powers, were replaced with a new elite, a new African elite. And this is a key aspect of neo-colonialism, which I believe many people overlook, is that it's a symbiotic relationship where, in order for colonial powers to perpetuate and achieve their interests in Africa, it requires the input and support of domestic African stakeholders, oftentimes the new elite as they came to be. And as we've argued, and as many other academics have argued, the new elite within these newly liberated African countries did not necessarily have the best interests of their people or economies at heart. They perpetuated a political economy which was largely based on rent and extracting personal gain from the economy, all of which was at the expense of the broader society and the sustainability of their economies. So rather than plowing revenue and investment in towards key infrastructure, ensuring the stability of the rule of law, supporting civil society. Much of these resources and indeed their interests went towards perpetuating a system of patronage which benefited themselves and a select few, among whom were many of the erstwhile colonial powers. And so that's one of the reasons why Africa today is home to many of the world's poor. That's why you have instances where an elite live very prosperous and pampered lives, and yet the ordinary citizens within these countries live below the poverty line, oftentimes. And so this is the neo-colonialism which many of us have come to understand and which has been discussed in literature over the decades. But where things change, and again, this is the main thrust of our paper, is how this form of neo-colonialism has evolved to become more malign. Now, neo-colonialism, as we originally understood it, was between former European colonial entities and African elites. What we now see is that under this malign form of neo-colonialism is that it's no longer former colonial or European powers who have a say in influencing the affairs of African countries. We now see this expanding to a range of middle powers in particular. So, for example, and again, we use the case study of the Central African Republic and Sudan, where in the former Central African Republic, you have a very close relationship between Russia's Wagner forces, or today the Africa Corps, and the incumbent government in the Central African Republic. And this is very simply based on strategic and economic interests. So through Wagner, and again today, the Africa Corps, Russia is able to access many of the mineral resources in the Central African Republic, namely diamonds and gold. And in doing so, or as part of the symbiotic relationship, they lend their services to the incumbent government in the Central African Republic, whether this be in terms of military training, whether this be in terms of providing them with sophisticated and modern armaments. It can even be the most basic in terms of close protection services. So if the president were to attend a rally, you would oftentimes see Wagner or indeed Africa Corps personnel flanking him by either side. And so Russia gains in that it has access to these mineral resources, which, as many have documented, it uses to sustain its conflict in Ukraine. And the government in the Central African Republic benefits because it is able to further strengthen its grip on power. So one hand washes the other, as it were. When you look at Sudan, it's a very similar example. Sudan, as I'm sure many of you know, has been engulfed in a civil war for the better part of 2 years. Conflict broke out in Khartoum in April. So this month, in fact, was the anniversary, 15th of April. And a key external stakeholder in fueling that conflict is the United Arab Emirates, the UAE. And we also see other players involved, whether it be Iran, Turkey, Russia as well has also had a role to play. There have even been reports of Ukrainian forces engaged in military activities in Sudan. And essentially that follows a very similar line of thinking that we see in the Central African Republic, where these external powers, whether it's Russia, Iran, or Turkey, they have their own strategic and economic interests. If you look at the Gulf countries, for them, it's very much about the balance of power within the region over there. For others, it's also geostrategic. So Russia has been very eager to establish a naval base on the Red Sea, which they've successfully achieved. And all of this is happening with their interactions between the two main belligerents in Sudan. So you have the Sudanese armed forces, which is essentially the government in Sudan, fighting against the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, which is a militia or an extended arm of the Sudanese armed forces. And they've been engaged in this conflict, which in very many ways is quite simply based on a struggle for power. But this has obviously been fueled with external stakeholders. So again, if you think about Russia, if you think about UAE, they've provided drones to various sides. There's also been shipments of arms to the SAF and RSF. And again, much like in the Central African Republic, the benefit for these countries is not only strategic, but it's also economic. There is tremendous amounts of gold which is funneled through Sudan and which is transported in particular to Dubai, where it is then sold as clean gold, as it were, on the international market. And needless to say, the people who suffer the most, whether it's in the Central African Republic or Sudan, is the ordinary citizens, right? There have been countless reports by organizations, whether it's Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the United Nations, identifying the atrocities which have been committed in these countries, whether it be rape, torture, indiscriminate killings. And unfortunately, because these are, if I could put it this way, parts of Africa, they seemingly do not receive as much attention as perhaps other conflicts in the world today. And so there's very little, or there are very little measures in place to try and address these issues. And again, as we argue in the paper, this is likely to deteriorate. It's not likely to get better. And the reason for that is because of the damage we see being inflicted to the liberal international order. So at a structural level, what we see is the hegemonic power in the form of the United States under the new second Trump administration, taking a very different approach towards the themes of multilateralism, sovereignty, human rights, all of the themes which were enshrined in the Bandung Declaration. We see the rise of a multipolar world order, as I alluded to earlier, the rise of middle powers and their engagements in the world, and even entities like the United Nations, which again, when you go back to 1955, was a key part of the declaration, right? It was, how do we strengthen and abide by the Charter of the United Nations? And what we see is the United Nations going through a bit of an identity and existential crisis, right? If we look at its efforts to try and resolve the conflict in Ukraine, if we look at how it has been treated in Israel vis-a-vis Gaza, the fact that the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, was made persona non grata by the Israeli government, all of this speaks to the fact that multilateralism is under threat, and it's suffering, and it's weak. And so if we go back to 1955, a lot of hope was placed in multilateralism, particularly the United Nations, in thinking that governments could work together in resolving issues. But if anything, it seems as though the opposite is taking effect. And so when you look at the malign, or the rise of malign neocolonialism in Africa, it's unfortunately, we believe, not going to stop in the Central African Republic and Sudan. These are, of course, two apt case studies. But as the liberal international order continues to recede, as middle powers increasingly look to pursue strategic and economic interests elsewhere in the world, they will continue to operate in fragile environments where they can act with impunity. And unfortunately, Africa is one such territory where they've been able to benefit greatly due to its fragility, due to weak governance and the absence of democracy, and without an external multilateral entity such as the United Nations able and willing to actually address the core issues within these countries, it is likely that we are going to see an increase in this malign neo-colonialism. And just south of Sudan, in South Sudan, we can already see ruptures taking place there, already talk of happening around yet another conflict. Of course, South Sudan, born in 2011, out of the conflict which had originally taken place in Sudan. And so it's fairly, I think it's safe to assume, or to at least posit, that the security and sovereignty of African countries moving forward is likely to deteriorate if the current structural issues remain in place and we are unable to resolve them. So while we certainly celebrate Bandung and the 70th anniversary and all that it achieved, I think it's important, at least from an African perspective, and I'm speaking to you from Johannesburg here in South Africa, it's important that we take stock of just what is happening on the continent today. And we be honest and we acknowledge that in some instances, it is original signatories of the Bandung Declaration who themselves are participating and perpetuating this malign neo-colonialism. And so the spirit of Bandung, at least in an African context, I don't want to speak for my Asian friends and colleagues, but at least in an African context, the spirit of Bandung has been very short-lived. And it is certainly troubling what we see ahead. And we believe that if we are to arrest the spread of malign neo-colonialism in Africa, then we certainly do need to return to the spirit of Bandung, which is namely respect for human rights, respect for the sovereignty of independent nations, and support for multilateral efforts to resolve disputes. So that's the main thrust of our paper. That is the presentation from my side. Of course, happy to answer any questions that may arise in the Q&A session. And thank you once again to the Pakistan Institute for International Affairs for the opportunity to speak. And I wish you a fruitful weekend of engagements. So thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is in no need of introduction, but I'm being obstinate, and I would like to use this opportunity to add my words. So, our most illustrious host, Dr. Masuma Hasan, is Pakistan's most revered academic, who's in an institution in her own right. She happens to be Pakistan's first female PhD in international relations from Cambridge University. She chairs Pakistan's oldest think tank, where we are sitting, established by her father, Khwaja Sarwar Hasan, who was a close associate of Mr. Jinnah. She presides on Pakistan's oldest and most prestigious social science journal, which has a record-breaking history of never missing a single issue or a single volume for all these decades, which means it's a miracle in its own right, because really, journals come out and they go out very easily in our country. She has held the highest positions in civil bureaucracy as cabinet secretary, in diplomacy as Pakistan's permanent representative in the UN office in Vienna, in IAEA, in UNIDO, and chaired the group of 77 in China. I have still more. She was Pakistan's ambassador to Austria, Slovenia. She wouldn't like to, toot her own horn, so therefore I'm tooting it. And Slovakia. She was the director of NIPA. She has authored numerous books, one of which has recently published in 2022, entitled Pakistan in the Age of Turbulence, which happens to be a bit of her memoir. I welcome Dr. Saiba. She is speaking on colonizing Kashmir. Thank you, Dr. Rukhsana, for such a kind introduction. I don't really deserve all these laurels. Yes, you do. But thank you in any case. Today I will be speaking on colonizing Kashmir. I've written something on it, so I will partly read it out. So ever since recorded history, powerful states have dominated and colonized weaker nations. European countries which colonized the most in recent times were the United Kingdom, France, Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, Germany, and Russia, to name only a few countries. Today I will speak about the issue of the colonization of Jammu and Kashmir by India. With a population of more than 12 million people, Indian-occupied Kashmir is the only Muslim-majority state in the Indian Union. There was supposed to be a map which I was supposed to refer to, but I don't see it anywhere. Kashmir, Indian-occupied Kashmir covers 2/3 of the territory of Kashmir. There is a sliver of territory known as Azad Kashmir, which is administered by Pakistan, and an area in the larger Kashmir region called Aksai Chin. There's the map. An area in the larger Kashmir region called Aksai Chin, in which China has an interest. You will see that towards the north, there is also a small piece of territory, which is the Shaksgam Valley of Aksai Chin, which Pakistan ceded to China in 1963, according to a boundary agreement between the two countries. In dealing with this issue, there are two ironies. India, the colonizing power in Kashmir, was itself a colony of the British Empire, much vaunted as the jewel in its crown. The second irony is that Kashmir is being colonized by a power, India, which from every forum in the world has declared that it is its integral part. So you are here colonizing an area or a territory which you have long considered as your integral part. After partition in 1947, Jammu and Kashmir was not subsumed into India in the manner of other Indian states. Under Article 370 of the Indian Constitution, around which most of this narrative revolves, it had a special status with its own constitution and flag and administrative autonomy. The central government was responsible only for defense, foreign affairs, and communication. The state gave special rights to permanent residents in matters such as property, education, and government jobs. In 2018, the Supreme Court of India declared that Article 370 had acquired a permanent status. Moreover, another article, which is probably more important, Article 35A of the Indian Constitution, empowered Jammu and Kashmir's state legislature to provide special rights and privileges to its permanent residents, not available to the Indian citizens in general, with respect to purchasing land and property, the right to vote and contest elections, to seek government jobs and access higher education and healthcare. However, the Bharatiya Janata Party, that is the BJP of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, had pledged in its election manifestos to integrate Jammu and Kashmir into the Indian Union. And this is exactly what it did on the 5th of August 2019 by revoking Article 370, doing away with Kashmir's special status, and reorganizing it into two union territories, Jammu and Kashmir on the one hand and Ladakh on the other. It is necessary here to refer to the Kashmir dispute between Pakistan and India, which is the oldest issue on the agenda of the United Nations, and Indian-administered Kashmir is the most militarized region in the world. It is estimated that anywhere up to 900,000 Indian security forces, army and paramilitary, are based in Kashmir. Since January 1949,
the United Nations Military Observer Group in India and Pakistan, has been functioning, headquarters for half the year in Islamabad and the other half in Srinagar. The mission, which is headed by a senior general from a UN member country, supervises the ceasefire between Pakistan and India in the state of Jammu and Kashmir. With this background, we are dealing here with the classic case of colonization. India has tried to alter the demography of Kashmir by engineering settler colonialism, settling non-Kashmiris, and changing domicile laws to their advantage. Thousands of outsiders have been granted domicile certificates, allowed to purchase property, and given voting rights, thus slashing the state's Muslim majority. The state is governed under numerous draconian laws, some of which operate concurrently, and I'll just mention a few of them, such as the Jammu and Kashmir Public Safety Act, Jammu and Kashmir Disturbed Areas Act, and the dreaded TADA, the Terrorist and Disruptive Activities Act, and the Prevention of Terrorism Act 2002. All these laws give sweeping powers to search, detain without trial on mere suspicion, seize and destroy property, and some of them facilitate extrajudicial executions. Since the 1990s, Kashmir Intifada, that is the insurgency in Kashmir, thousands of people have been tortured, killed, blinded by pellets, have disappeared, or have been detained by the Indian authorities. They are held in prisons in various parts of India, making it difficult for their families to contact them. The most famous Kashmiri prisoner today is probably Yasin Malik, chairman of the Jammu Kashmir Liberation Front, who has been sentenced to life imprisonment by a special Delhi court on charges of terror financing, although he had renounced violence and wanted to pursue peaceful methods in resolving the Kashmir conflict. The eventual goal of the Jammu and Kashmir Liberation Front is a secular and independent Kashmir, comprising territories administered by both Pakistan and India. He is being held in Delhi's Tihar jail, which is said to be the largest prison complex in South Asia. The only bizarre consolation, if there can be a consolation, in this case could be that the Tihar jail complex has housed many famous Indians, including Kashmiri leaders Afzal Guru and Maqbool Bhatt. Afzal Guru was tried and sentenced to death for his attack on the Indian Parliament in 2001. His trial was considered flawed by several legal experts, and there were many appeals worldwide for clemency. Maqbool Bhatt was a Kashmiri separatist leader who was called Father of the Kashmiri Nation, that is Baba-e-Qaum, by his people. Both of them were executed in Tihar jail and were buried in its premises to avoid a public funeral and a backlash in Kashmir. An internet and communications blackout has frequently been imposed in Kashmir, shutting it out from the rest of the world. Military operations, curfews, and resistance by the Kashmiri youth have affected livelihoods and education and healthcare. And here, I want to especially mention the half-widows of Jammu and Kashmir. Half-widows is a special term used only for Kashmiri women whose husbands have disappeared and are still missing and can't be traced. Their marital status is ambiguous and the cause of great uncertainty in their lives. In most families, as we know, a husband is the sole provider of family incomes. So when he disappears, the half-widow and her children often become destitute. The half-widows cannot access income from their husband's property or his bank accounts. Moreover, they are socially unprotected and face isolation within their communities. They therefore become victims of all kinds of violence and of displacement. These women are silent sufferers with no emotional closure in sight. But today, the struggle in Kashmir is not just for self-determination, but also against severe human rights violations. Amnesty International has called for an end to atrocities in occupied Kashmir and has reached out to G20 nations through a special communique. It has called upon India to stop curbs on freedom of expression and peaceful assembly and the targeting of human rights defenders. Human Rights Watch has extensively documented human rights violations by the Indian government, including rape, civilian killings and firings, deaths in custody, indiscriminate firing at unarmed protesters, and gruesome torture. Human Rights Watch has also issued a report on India's secret army in Kashmir. Now, the traditional Kashmiri leadership, which fought for self-determination, merger with Pakistan, or even an independent state, has given way to militant groups such as the People's Anti-Fascist Front, the Resistance Front, and the Kashmir Tigers. According to Durdana Najm, who writes from Lahore, Kashmiri insurgents have shifted from being the stone-pelting amateur fighters employing hit-and-run tactics against one of the world's most formidable armies to becoming a well-organized liberation force. They are now equipped with advanced capabilities, a stronger resolve, and renewed vigor to confront India's military operations directly. Apart from changing Kashmir's demography, the Modi government is trying to win over the Kashmiris through developmental works. Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru is reported to once have told Sheikh Abdullah, who was his nemesis as well as his friend. Sheikh Abdullah has been called the Lion of Kashmir, that India would bind Kashmir with golden chains. The Modi government showcases Kashmir and Jammu and Kashmir as a tourist haven. We've just seen what has happened in Pahalgam, and Srinagar as a smart city. However, the people of Kashmir are skeptical about the Indian government's large-scale developmental projects. For instance, a key mega road project spanning many areas has disturbed them as thousands of trees have been axed, and locals fear that such projects will upset the region's ecological balance, displace communities, and change the demography and cultural fabric of the state. It remains to be seen how India's colonizing project in Kashmir will pan out. But before I conclude, I would like to make a reference to General Pervez Musharraf's four-point formula for Kashmir, which he put forth in Agra when he went to Agra, the Agra summit in July 2001. There were 4 points. The first point was demilitarization or phased withdrawal of troops. How they would be phased out and how gradually had to be worked out. The second point was no change of borders of Kashmir. People would be allowed to move freely across the line of control so that there would be a porous border. The third point was self-governance without independence. Neither side would become independent, but they would be able to govern their own territories. And the fourth point was joint supervision mechanism in Jammu and Kashmir, involving India, Pakistan, as well as the Kashmiris. So the Kashmiris would be taken on board. Now, although General Musharraf's formula had made some concessions, we had shifted back from part of our stand, and a porous border between the two sides of Kashmir would have been a blessing for its people, the Indian government rejected it out of hand. India's stand remains complete ownership of all parts of Kashmir, including Gilgit-Baltistan. However, Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh once later explained that making the line of control a porous border would lead to a free flow of ideas and people between the two parts of Kashmir, and that one day the LOC would become irrelevant. Thank you.
Thank you, Rukhsana. Our third and last speaker is Dr. Farooq Khan. He's an associate professor at the Lahore University of Management Sciences. He has a PhD from Kent University and has done several courses at Oxford, Columbia University, Berkeley, and Middlesex University. Dr. Khan has been focusing on 10 different countries to study the nexus between development and migration. He has been a recipient of many prestigious fellowships and worked on projects supported by USAID, UNICEF, UNESCO, World Bank, and the Swedish International Development Agency. He shall speak on cultural resistance through subversive epistemologies. Welcome, Dr.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much. First of all, I'd like to thank the Pakistan Institute of International Affairs and, of course, Dr. Masuma Hasan for giving me this opportunity. Have been extremely pleased to be here and have learned so much from people who've spent time in the field, as well as scholars who've been working on this. ये इसको आगे पीछे करने के लिए मेरे पास होगा या आपके पास होगा? और ये पॉइंट किस साइड पे करना है? कहीं पे भी करना? Okay. Again, I don't normally work on international relations, but I've been working in post-colonial studies. That's what my PhD was on, and I worked on partition. But lately, I've been working on and around issues of migration. So you do have a connection between the kind of, again, not that well defined, but what countries which are called global north and global south. So in conjunction with that, I'll speak again the presentation I had prepared, and of course one realizes that as the time for the actually presentation of your presentation comes closer, then you realize that so many things that you wanted to say have already been said. So I'll skip some of those slides. Okay, and again, since I'm coming from purely teaching side, my focus is much more on the education side, which is the reason, as I said, I've chosen epistemologies. Of course, one could have looked at the economic side, maybe through creative arts, different fields, but I am much more focused on how is it that through education, through maybe younger people, through marginalized communities, what are some of the ways in which certain countries, including Pakistan, can try to resist or at least maybe like reduce the obstacles which exist in the current imbalanced systems which exist in the world. Globalization, again, I don't need to tell this audience, globalization and the discourse on globalization is heavily Western, Eurocentric perspective, which the fact that we are sitting here speaking a particular language, which is, again, global language, again, which has its merits and demerits, but in a sense, what happens is that these are some of the models which get replicated in countries in the global south. So one doesn't necessarily need colonialism to be in effect. What Richard Morrow had said earlier on, that you have neocolonialism in its place. So these things, they tend to continue because so many of these practices are in fact, internalized by people, including, as I said, someone who works in the formal educational system, that's something that one is actually aware of. Bandung, I will not say much because, again, as I said, people have said a lot. One thing which someone had not mentioned, which I did like, which is the last part, that a significant aspect of Bandung conference highlighted by Malcolm X was the exclusion of white Western powers, which facilitated unity among participating nations. So again, as someone who's again who studies Malcolm X, this was something I felt that maybe it hadn't been mentioned. So other things are already there. Again, in the second part, is that yes, Bandung, fantastic opportunity, but yet there was resistance. The resistance was led by the US and other Western powers. And the aftermath, and because I don't know whether this particular term was used, the neutralist, that was a term which was coined for this group because the US and others felt that because you had China's presence there, so it was somehow naturally aligned closer to their system. Whether that was true or not, I mean, again, that wasn't taken into consideration, but because they were excluded and they felt that it had to be something which wasn't really kosher enough for them. The second point in that is that in the 60s, you see these Western powers actually doing something about it, which is actively disrupting this semblance of, again, what people who've studied that historic moment, the goodwill that it kind of even now, in terms of as far as the discourse is concerned, it still creates that. But the thing is, there was an active attempt in the political, social arena to disrupt that. And so in the 60s, you have these, at least these three more famous coups which are mentioned. And that in itself, what it did was that it drove a message. That, okay, if you're going to continue down that particular, this is one of the things that you could be. So again, implicit, not necessarily maybe overt threat, but overt threat had been carried out. Okay. So the last point I'll say about Bandung and now is that, and again, the economic center, the economic kind of maybe power that has shifted to Asia, again, China, other countries. And I think, again, with the stuff which is happening in the US, that shift is almost kind of inevitable. There is no way that Atlantic or the West or the global North will be able to avoid that. But, and again, this is something that others have much more eloquently expressed, the political maybe fruits or the fallout or the impact, that is something which unfortunately has been lacking. But again, I would just say something to what Professor Zadie said earlier on, that yes, it's a mourning, but again, we need to see that that's not an almost kind of an ontological position. That is something that which can change. It is not something one can't say that because for the 70 years that spirit has gone down, that there is no way to say that that's how it naturally is. Like, and that's something that I think in Pakistan we are kind of continue to say on so many, नहीं, हम तो हैं ही ऐसे, हम कभी भी नहीं हो सकता. There isn't necessarily a कभी भी. That's what I tell my students, that whenever someone makes such a generalized statement, you ask them, what's the time period that you're talking about? Always means what? 500 साल, 1000 साल, 10,000 साल. Is human civilization 10,000 साल? No, of course not. So these are kind of almost tiny blips in institutional and human history. So I continue to believe that yes, maybe that was a time period that, Bandung was there. But the thing is, again, these things, just because they are down, and as I mentioned, that Western powers, including the US, they were bringing down other governments. Now you don't really need other governments to bring down a government. Let's see what happens there. But yeah, I don't want to say anything. I'm not a diplomat. There are too many diplomats here, so they can express these things much more eloquently than me. Okay, so. Okay, now the thing is, what one needs to see is that these are systems in place. These are things which, again, they are not ontological. There is a history, there are certain underlying reasons, there are concepts, there are discourses which are perpetuated hand in glove. That is, again, the hallmark of colonialism. Colonialism was one, yes, again, always about exploitation. That was the primary objective of colonization. And then added to that was, again, or the underlying reason for that was the civilizational superiority. That we from Britain, from England, were coming to teach savages, and these, again, as was mentioned earlier, we are sitting in a place which has Mohenjo-daro. We have places in the African continent, which had pyramids. We had so many things, so well advanced or before the European Enlightenment, and yet that is the, again, to use the colloquial term, the churan, which was sold to people in the global south, and which unfortunately, humne wo churan, whatever. As I said, I apologize, मैं थोड़ी सी अगर undiplomatic language में थोड़ा सा use कर रहा हूँ. Okay, all right, churan is okay, thank you. So I have it from an authorities of, all right, thank you, sir. So now the thing is, what one is saying is, how are these systems in place? Maybe I'll mention two, again, people whose work has inspired and has allowed me to kind of, again, maybe try to understand things. One is Gramsci and the second is Frantz Fanon. And in Gramsci's idea, he talks about two terms which, again, I feel are so relevant in the discussion that we are having. One which he calls organic, and the second is conjunctural. Organic, there is something which is at a civilizational scale. There is something which takes much longer period than we might view in our human lives. वो colonization हो जाए, वो कोई और चीज हो जाए, again, rise of maybe certain nations, this would take a decade, a century, maybe a couple of centuries, okay? So, and for us to, the fact that we are talking about global north and global south, that is not something which has happened overnight, okay? So there is, that's an example of an organic a moment, an organic structure. So to overcome that, if one is to say, okay, fine, you lead this anti-colonial or what kind of an effort, and we think, again, Bandung being an example, that, that was an attempt, and one of the core issues for, again, for people at Bandung who gathered was end of colonialism. But the fact that it has not been successful, within a span of 70 years, we have people know we are going to mourn that, and that is dead, and uska janaza nikal gaya, and fulana, and all that stuff. No. Again, if you are looking at it as an organic matter, the global north and global south, it would take a much longer time period, effort from different fields. These were maybe leaders. Now you need something from the students. Now you need something from the economic side. Now you need something from the women. You need something from the workers. So again, that is how one needs to kind of overcome these things. Conjunctural moments, for example, these are things which right now we are passing through a conjunctural moment. Okay, because if for Pakistan we are going to say organic movement would be that what Pakistan and maybe many other post-colonial nations, the kind of governance that they were able to provide in countries. So the political systems, and of course there are many reasons for that. Somehow they were not able to fulfill the promises which were made to the people. Countries were not able to realize their potential. So again, those could be internal, external, जो भी वो चीज वो होती है. Conjunctural, on the other hand, as I said, is the conflict that we have right now. Okay, conjunctural is, for example, our elections. Conjunctural is, again, political situation, however one wants to look at it. So again, one is able to say these things which maybe are controversial because again, one is sitting mostly with people who know what the situation is. So the reason why one is saying is that if you want to subvert the kind of this slave master almost relationship which exists, one needs to engage on a multi-sectoral level. And again, this superficial anti-imperialism kind of just coming up with these short-term solutions, they would most often than not, or almost inevitably, they will fail because the system that you are opposing, again, which kind of presents itself as an ontological system, this is the way that nature has designed it. Hum naturally inferior hain, they are naturally superior. This is all social constructions. Fanon again talks more on the political side of it because of, again, I'm sure all of you know about Fanon, that Fanon as a Martinique, a black Martinique psychologist, who goes and studies at the best institutions in France, and then there is that kind of almost conjectural moment of clarity. He's walking down in Paris and there is a child, and the child looks at him and says, "Mama, look, a black man." So for Fanon, that is like, again, that French or France told him that, okay, fine, you abandon everything that your maybe cultural knowledge stood for. If you embraced French culture, it wouldn't really matter who you were. Okay, so that, again, it was something that was internalized and that is broken. And then, of course, he goes to Algeria, and there he deals with the people who are, again, the Algerian resistance and the atrocities that the French committed on them. And of course, uske baad, he has seminal works on that, the impact that it has on people. So Fanon's view in terms of the political, again, the political knowledge or the societal is much more confrontational because he believes that this is epistemic violence. That's what colonialism was. So the return has to be violent in a way. I don't know how successful, and again, Malcolm X spoke about that. I don't know how successful a model that is. I think, again, even if that is going to happen, it needs to have a critical discourse which takes in perspectives from other people. Again, and that's something, again, looking at it, the organic and conjecture, looking at it from Pakistan's case, we are in this vicious, I think vicious ke spelling galat hai udhar, sorry. Okay, yeah. Spiral of organic crisis with history of reliance on external powers. So, of course, I mean, nobody's saying that, are you saying that Pakistan should not have external? Of course, Pakistan should. But again, the thing is that what one needs to kind of examine how many of those are in our favor, how much of that has created benefits, not maybe just for the governance structure, but for the people of Pakistan. How much time do I have? Okay, okay. मेरी भी बड़ी लंबी presentation. So that's okay. Again, before I think maybe my time runs out, I have a lot of points, but for preparing for this paper, for this presentation, I came across a truly fantastic academic research. Again, I'm a literature person, so numbers, ना मुझे इनकी समझ आती है, and I'm kind of averse to numbers के quantify कर लो ये and what. But this was something which was absolutely fantastic. This is Jason Hickel. He teaches in Barcelona. He's from Swaziland. Now I think that country is called something. Is called Eswatini. Now, thank you, sir. So yeah, so him and three other anthropologists, they have written on this, and what they've done is that they've used environmental input and output data. And earlier on, we had Senator Sherry Rehman talk about climate change and how this is such an important issue. Again, I don't need to tell people, for a country like Pakistan. So he's used the environmental input-output footprint modeling system along with his colleagues, and their economists, and it has been unbelievable the numbers that he's been able to, and this is published in a refereed journal. So again, as not necessarily an expert in this area, it literally kind of blew my mind. Basically, what is it that he's saying? He calculates, and again, he makes a division between global north and global south. And he calculates, him and his team, between, I think, 1999 and from 1990 to 2015. He looks at different data which exist. And these are some of the things that he finds. They're mentioned here, but I'll just read them from here. And he focuses on unequal exchange rate. And again, keep in mind what we talked about, the organic system, which Gramsci had kind of mentioned. So if you're talking about global north and global south, which are in that particular definition. So concept of centers on the idea that the global north, due to its economic and geopolitical power, maintains a stronger bargaining position that allows it to push down the prices of resources and labor it imports from the global south. This means that for every unit of embodied resources or labor the south imports from north, it has to export significantly larger quantity of its own resources and labor just to pay for it. And now, again, the thing is, maybe earlier on, again, one wasn't necessarily aware of trade deals. These were things which were done on the table, thanks to Trump and others. I mean, like now the first thing they say is, okay, fine, we're going to Ukraine, we want resources. Pakistan or other places, there are a number of people who are interested in resources. So it is about resource extraction. Resource extraction for the benefit of the countries in the global north, or you would, us would get like pittance for that. The scale of this unequal exchange, according to Hickel's research, from 1990 to 2015 is immense. Some key figures highlighting this scale include, in 2015 alone, the North net appropriated from the South 12 billion tons of raw materials, 822 million hectares of embodied land, 21 exajoules. This is again a term, a huge term, I think, joules to the power 8 or 18 joules of energy, 188 million person years of embodied labor in 1 year. So this is the amount of effort which was required in terms of, if one looks at the trade between global north and global south. The monetary value of this net drain in 2015, valued at northern prices, was $10.8 trillion. $10.8 trillion in 1 year. That is how much advantage global North gained from global South. Over the entire period from 1990 to 2015, the total appropriate is $242 trillion. That's the advantage from these kind of impoverished countries and poor countries and what I call them banana republics and absolute monarchies, all these places. This is the advantage which has been gained. Hickel points out that 10.8 trillion drained in 2015 alone could have ended could have ended extreme poverty 70 times over in 1 year. This is the kind of scale, that's why it boggles the mind, and one can say, okay, fine, just we'll leave it to the experts. We don't know. I mean, things have always been like this. What is the alternative? The thing is, whatever the alternative might be, I can't really think that it could have been as bad as it has been. For the raw material and land, it was 5-1. For the labor, people in the global South, they had to put in 13 hours, man hours of work for 1 man hour of work that was in. Last point. What is it that a global North, a global South can do? And again, I will use an example. I don't know how many of you are aware about DeepSeek. Okay? China kind of threw in this $1 trillion or more than a couple of $1 trillion spanner in that, again, that organic movement which existed. Oh, Western and North American, AI technologies way ahead and all that stuff. This was an example of subverting that particular narrative. Over a weekend, I think $3 trillion was lost. So, and again, the reason I mention this is because China was from Bandung. Okay, so again, that's the reason I'm looking at this example. What else can be done? So you have this human-computer interaction. Arab and African countries, they are doing significant work in this. How do you kind of train the AI models using knowledge which exists within your own societies? Pakistan अभी इसमें पीछे है, but again, this is something which is a low-hanging fruit. Reason being that people have certain amount of skills which can be used to kind of, again, change the way that maybe technology is used in the future. I have other things, but I will just shut up here. Thank you very much for your patience and for listening to me. Thank you.
And Frantz Fanon. It's very trendy, by the way, right now amongst young academics to quote Frantz Fanon.
Okay.
We used to study it in the 80s. So it's a little passé for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I have a quote from Frantz Fanon. I have two quotes from Wretched of the Earth. One is, and this is why I respect Mr. Mushahid Hussain a lot, for his stance on Gaza. Frantz Fanon said, every spectator is either a coward or a traitor. And the second quote is from Frantz Fanon's book, but from the preface, and which is written by Jean-Paul Sartre, who said colonial administrators were not paid to read Karl Marx.
Okay.
So, essentially, one of the big spirits of Bandung was that the countries were not only interested in their own decolonization, they were interested in their friendly countries and neighboring countries and other third world countries' decolonization also. And in the spirit, it's so interesting. All right. A student of defense and strategic studies once taught me something. She said, ma'am, sometimes the perception of threat is bigger than threat itself. And diplomats would know this very well. We have such august diplomats amongst us. I would just simply give for your mulling 6 examples of what happened after the Bandung conference. Sometimes you have to be explicit instead of alluding to it. Kwame Nkrumah was visiting, this is now in the aftermath of the conference itself, how the West reacted to the conference. Kwame Nkrumah was on a visit to China, and CIA orchestrated a coup d'etat against him, which was bloodless, and he was overthrown. Sukarno, there was a coup orchestrated against him by his local military, but it was enabled from the outside. And you know, we can draw a lot of lessons from Africa to ourselves. So we're not talking about Africa in isolation. This includes promoting good governance, strengthening democratic processes, and building resilient state institutions capable of addressing security challenges. Promoting regional cooperation. Instead of always looking towards the West, we can try to soften our relationships regionally and learn from each other. Engaging with external partners, international actors can support Africa's development and security efforts in a way that respects African sovereignty and promotes sustainable and inclusive development. Holding external actors responsible. I would like to bring forth a concept of the Dutch disease. Sudan, for instance, a Dutch disease is when suddenly a country comes into massive natural resources like golds and diamonds. You know, minerals are being discussed right now in our own country, and I keep wondering about the day when this will all become a contentious or conflictual issue, which is so dangerous because according to Paul Collier, who's a professor at Cambridge University, you know, if you already have existing conflicting relations within the society, and you suddenly acquire the Dutch disease, it can be one of the most explosive things which can actually fragment a country. So Sudan has this gold thing going on with UAE, Turkey, China, Russia, all involved in it. And then we should use international mechanisms to hold these external actors responsible. It's very terrifying, this report by Richard Morrow about how the Wagner Group is involved in Africa. And it's kind of undermining, well, the state actors are involved with the Wagner Group. It's called Africa Corps now. It has changed its name, and it's fully involved in orchestrating and undermining the governments of African countries. Sadly, though, I was once reading a book by Walter Rodney called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, and I ran into my supervisor, Lee Casanelli, and said, he laughed at me, and he said, why don't you write a book, How Africa Underdeveloped Africa? So, you know what I mean? It's not only external variables, but people enabling, abetting for their own private little, you know, fortunes in Africa, these factors. I really love the 4 points Dr. Saiba said about Musharraf, and that if we had a porous LOC, then it would be good for us to exchange ideas, etc. And you, I even forgot what you said.
Okay, it's okay.
Because I lost track.
It's okay.
Question and answer.
Ji, can we please open the floor for questions and answers? Ji.
Thank you very much. I would say that this has also been a very intellectually stimulating session with a lot of information, and Dr. Khurram Khan Sahab, well done. And I'd just like to add a couple of points because mention was made about John Foster Dulles. There's a very good book which has just come out in America called The Brothers by Stephen Kinzer. And it's about John Foster Dulles, who was the US Secretary of State from 53 to 1961, 59, because then he died. And his brother, Alan Welsh Dulles, who was the CIA chief at the same time. And these two Dulles brothers were the ones who did everything which went wrong in the third world, the coup d'etats, the invasions. After the Bandung conference, John Foster Dulles said, and I think this reinforces what Dr. Khurram Khan was saying, that, Farhan, he said that neutrality or non-alignment are immoral. And that was the US official doctrine on this issue. And that's why the series of coups that started. And the first order to oust Sukarno was given to the CIA on 27 September 1957 by President Eisenhower, that Sukarno has to go. So there were attempts on his life, there were coup attempts. Of course, they failed in the first 3 or 4 times, and then they succeeded. So I think Bandung had a tremendous impact. And I think the spirit of Bandung, in my view, still lives, because now we are seeing the dawn of the Asian century. I mean, that is the spirit of Bandung, the spirit of defiance, and the spirit of autonomy for the third world countries of the global south. To say that it's a period of mourning, I frankly don't agree with that, because I think we are seeing President Trump is presiding over a declining America, where the global balance of economic and political power is shifting inexorably, inevitably, and irreversibly from the west to the east. So I think देख मशरक से उभरते हुए सूरज को देख, इलामा इकबाल ने कहा था, वो सूरज तो तुलू हो रहा है, माशाअल्लाह. So we should celebrate that. Thank you. And thanks to Dr. Masuma for keeping the spirit alive. He deserves, I think, a special award also. We should give a special Bandung award. Because her father played a role and you played.
Thank you very much for all the panelists. I tried to refrain myself from asking another question or making comment, but I couldn't help it. I think that if you look at the State Department website, there's something called Office of the Historian. And that official historian assessed Bandung favorably. I would recommend everyone to search in Google Office of Historian, US State Department official website. It's no longer updated. It says Bandung Conference demonstrated that the emerging independent nations have the capacity to get their voices heard. The second point is, I think the word spirit, we are approaching it from a rather human-centric, perspective. So, the birth of a spirit, the dying of the spirit, the death of the spirit. I would suggest alternatively, the ideals that were hatched, articulated, the Pancasila, 5 principles, the ideals are still there. Ideals are ideals. Maybe we will always we will fall short of realizing ideals fully. But that's the nature of ideals. So I think I would say we should refrain from going within the framework of spirit to pursuing the Bandung ideals. I think that would direct that in a more constructive fashion and less wasteful on debating the impact of Bandung or the legacy. We are looking forward. And finally, I think we don't want the power shift from the west to the east. If the east assumes the old colonial behaviors, we want a different type of world based on the principles of equality, political sovereignty, respect for internal democracy or processing. So I think the shift to Asian century, to me still sounds nationalistic, from which we are trying to move away from white nationalism that expresses itself as colonialism. So I think we need to shift the narrative here. We're not assessing simply the history. We're trying to project something to go forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And this is Sarfraz Korejo once again. This comment may be taken as a compliment to Madam Dr. Masuma Hasan and also Mushahid Hussain Sayed, as he talked about two brothers. So as far as the Kashmir and its colonization is concerned, we have the reference of the past by proud daughter and proud father, Joseph Corbell and Madeline Albright. So just as an opportunity, this Bandung conference, we have to revisit the past and reopen what Mushahid Hussain Sayed is reiterating, Iqbal Lahori Mashriq se dekh jo hai na. तो हमें भी ये देखना चाहिए और the document as we have in the history of Joseph Corbell, he was the chairman of the commission India Pakistan and Madeline Albright was also the secretary of state. So we have opportunity always, as Sikandar Mahdi says, South Asian never miss the opportunity to miss the opportunity. Thank you.
There's a question.
Thank you. My question to Dr. Masuma Hasan, that how do you view the prospect of peace between India and Pakistan in the light of recent terrorist incident in Indian-held Kashmir and the looming threat to the water sharing agreement between the both countries? Thank you.
You know, this is a very difficult question to answer because Kashmir, the whole issue has become so unpredictable because of the standoff between Pakistan and India. And that is reflected in what has happened in Pahalgam the other day. So I don't know. I don't think that in the near future, unless something different happens, in the near future with Mr. Narendra Modi in power in India and his Hindutva policies and his backlash against, all kinds of things like changing names of roads and which shows a kind of such a great prejudice against such an important part of Indian history. So one doesn't know how it's going to pan out. This is not a question that is very easy to answer. With respect to, unless a different kind of government comes there, I mean, I think the Congress people are far more moderate so far as relations with Pakistan are concerned. That is also a kind of irony because the standoff really started with Jawaharlal Nehru, but still, compared to the BJP, the Congress is far more moderate. With respect to water sharing, that question should be put to Ambassador Shafqat Kaka Khail. Is he here? He isn't here this time. But you can raise that issue when he speaks on the Indus Waters Treaty tomorrow, inshallah.
Yes, there's a question for Mr. Richard Morrow.
Mr. Richard, can you hear me? Mr. Richard. Mr. Richard, in your...
Yes, I can.
Sir, in your presentation, you said multilateralism is under threat. Is it under threat or is it already gone?
Interesting question. I would say it's under threat. I think to say that multilateralism is completely gone or is completely dead would be somewhat of an exaggeration. I think if we look at the United Nations, for example, it still has a very important role to play in the world. If we look at the conflict in Sudan, for example, it is the United Nations and the relief work that it is doing, which is probably at the forefront of that conflict. And, you know, if we look at discussions that are happening on the world today, you know, we still have to give credit to entities, whether it be the UN or the World Bank, IMF as well, for example. So it is certainly under threat. I don't want to downplay that reality. It's in a very precarious position right now, but I wouldn't go as far as to say that it is completely irrelevant or gone.
No.
Assalamu alaikum.
Jiva.
My name is Abbas Nanji. I'm a member of the institute. I have a small question, but a little big question for Senator Mushahid Hussain. He can please answer. He said that the American empire is a declining empire. Very good. Because it is very clearly written in the Bible that the fall of the empire will happen. I'm of the view that the empire may fall within 23 months. I have a cousin who is an American. He thinks it may not happen in 40 years. What do you think?
Okay, so
Yeah, or maybe after.
I think that we should know that what is happening in the United States of America today under President Donald Trump is something which was unthinkable. He is the first American president. And by the way, I was the one who had predicted that he'll come to power. And I was very consistent in my prediction. He is the first American president after John F. Kennedy who is not a representative of the traditional American security establishment. He has devised a plan, a 10-point plan for the demolition of the American deep state. And the kind of people he has installed as head of CIA, FBI, like FBI Chief Kash Patel has written a book, and I would recommend you read it. It's called Government Gangsters. It's about the US government, by the way. And then all the Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary. So already, you can see he has already lost the tariff war. This shift is there. I dared this decline of American imperial power or the American century. It started with the Iraq war. Because the Iraq war was an imperialist war, illegal, immoral, and unjust war by the neocons who wanted to control the Middle East. They failed, thankfully, because otherwise they would have turned on us also, by the way. And the American century, which started after World War II, in my view, officially ended on 15th August 2021, when they were evicted from Kabul in a very humiliating manner. So now we are seeing that this decline is going to be very clear. And I hope that Trump is not killed like Kennedy during this tenure, because the kind of things he's doing. The American war machine, the military industrial complex, is a permanent war machine, which is believing in regime change. You mentioned Rukhsana, from 1947 to 1989. And this was documented by Fareed Zakaria in his article in the Foreign Affairs. There were 72 attempts at regime change in the United States of America, World War II till the 89, because the end of the Cold War, by the CIA. So it's very clear that this deep state has been something. And if you see the war on terror, and I'll just add one line to that, because we compare China with the United States. After 9/11, the United States squandered $6.5 trillion. This is according to the Brown University study, not me, Rhode Island, in the so-called war on terror, including $2.2 trillion in Afghanistan. And that means $100 million a day for 20 years being spent there. $6.5 trillion, killing about 1 million Muslims, displacing 30 million in Fatah, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Somalia, Yemen, and sending down 324,000 bombs, missiles, and drones in that period. And the same period, after 9/11, China spent $2 trillion in 3,000 projects, economic projects, Asia, Africa, Latin America, Europe. And the latest one is a port in Peru, Chanque. So you can see, and they're also in Panama Canal. So you can see this is the difference. The US was busy fighting wars. The Chinese were building connectivity through the Belt and Road Initiative. So that is already there now. And I think, I feel that Trump basically is seeking a new Yalta that of three major powers, US, China, and Russia. And within 2 months, there will be a deal between the US and China because the US has already lost, I repeat it, they have lost the trade and tariff war with China and the rest of it because they overstepped. And now Trump is having a reality check. So, sir, inshallah, in your lifetime, in my lifetime, this biblical prophecy will come true. Thank you. And as a student of the Bible, I think this, I've been a student of Catholic schools, St. Anthony's, St. Mary's, Georgetown, वो कहते थे, Christ used to lament, they hear but they do not listen. But this time, I think the global south is listening. MashaAllah.
Okay, I think we should close the session. I'd like to thank Mr. Morrow, Dr. Hassan, and Dr. Khan. And thank you for your participation. And have a good evening.
My proposal is we have a Bandung award to be given to Masuma tomorrow.
Always reflected all awards.
Late in the day. But we have two parallel sessions which are equally important.
Yes, sir.
Can we shorten them and have one session?
It's not possible because then there would be 6 panelists. And topic is diverse. नहीं, topic diverse है, madam.
Because then you will lose all your audience.
But those who are interested in the issues of artificial intelligence and microchips, they may join the parallel session. Those who are interested in the rise of China, I think we cannot merge the two topics because...
8 minutes. 8 minutes.
At a cocktail party later on.
I have a little message for Mr. Morrow. Can you please pass on my condolences to Greg Mills? He was my director at SIAE at WITS many years ago. Tell him Rukhsana Siddiqui sent her regards, okay?
I shall do that. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Rukhsana and all the panelists.